May 3, 1945. The war in Europe is almost over, but in the Austrian Alps chaos still reigns. Hitler is dead. Berlin has fallen. Yet scattered SS units refuse to surrender, roaming the countryside like wounded beasts. Among the pine-covered slopes of Tyrol stands Castle Itter, a gray stone fortress perched above the village of the same name. Once a medieval stronghold, it had become something far stranger, a prison for some of Europe's most prominent captives, French generals, ministers, and even a tennis star. They were Hitler's political hostages, held under heavy guard by the SS. Inside the castle walls, the prisoners could hear the thunder of distant artillery echoing through the valleys. They knew liberation was near, but not near enough. Their SS guards had grown nervous and unpredictable, their loyalties fraying as the Reich collapsed. And then, on the night of May 3rd, something extraordinary happened. The guards vanished. They simply walked away, leaving the gates locked but unguarded. The French captives, generals, politicians, intellectuals, found themselves alone in a fortress surrounded by mountains. With no food, no radio, and no idea what forces might arrive first, the Americans. Or vengeful SS remnants. The war's final week had turned into a race for survival, and in that strange, narrow corner of history, enemies would become allies, and the last battle of the European war would be fought not for territory, but for honor. The prisoners at Castle Itter were not ordinary men. Among them were names that had once ruled France. There was Édouard Daladier, former prime minister; Paul Reynaud, another former premier; Maurice Gamelin, the general who had led France during the disastrous campaign of 1940, and even Jean Borotra, a famous tennis champion and French national hero. They were political hostages, taken from concentration camps and held here to serve as bargaining chips should Hitler need them. But now, with Hitler gone and Germany collapsing, their value was gone too. Tensions among them ran high. Old rivalries resurfaced. The French politicians, once bitter opponents, now sat in the same dining hall, arguing even as artillery rumbled in the distance. But outside the walls, danger was closing in. Abandoned by the SS, the castle was a magnet for marauding German troops, desperate deserters, and fanatical Waffen-SS units bent on revenge. One Czech prisoner, a brave man named Andreas Krobot, volunteered to escape the castle and seek help. He slipped out under the cover of night, scaling the steep hillside, dodging patrols, and riding a stolen bicycle into the unknown. His mission was simple but impossible: find the nearest American unit and convince them to save a castle full of French VIPs, deep inside enemy territory. The fate of the prisoners now depended on one man's courage and a sliver of luck. Andreas Krobot pedaled through the mountain roads for miles, dodging retreating Wehrmacht columns and groups of armed SS men who shot at anything that moved. After a long, perilous ride, he reached the outskirts of the town of Virgil, a place torn between surrender and defiance. There, he found an unlikely savior, Major Josef Sepp Gangl, a decorated officer of the German Wehrmacht. Gangl had once fought fiercely for the Reich, but now he had seen enough. He despised the SS and wanted only to save lives and bring peace to his town. When Krobot told him about the stranded French prisoners, Gangl made a decision that would change history. He chose to turn against the SS and fight alongside the Americans. He rode out under a white flag. Finding a small American reconnaissance unit commanded by Captain John C. Jack Lee, a tough, pragmatic tank officer from the 23rd Tank Battalion, Lee listened, skeptical at first. A German officer asking for help to save French prisoners from the SS? It sounded insane, but the story checked out. And Lee, a man who didn't back away from a challenge, agreed. In one of the strangest alliances of the war, Americans and Germans would now fight together, not against each other, but against the fanatical SS troops who still refused to surrender. On the morning of May 5, 1945, a convoy set out toward Castle Itter. It consisted of one American Sherman tank, a handful of infantrymen, and about 10 German Wehrmacht soldiers led by Major Gangl. They rolled through silent villages, past smoking ruins and abandoned vehicles. The war was ending everywhere, but here it wasn't over yet. The SS still prowled the forests, desperate and dangerous. The convoy advanced cautiously, cutting through narrow alpine roads. Along the way, they exchanged fire with scattered SS units, who melted into the trees as soon as the tank's main gun roared. By afternoon, they reached the slopes below Castle Itter. The tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny, struggled up the steep incline, its tracks grinding against gravel. When they arrived, the French prisoners could hardly believe their eyes. An American tank rolling up the hill, followed by German soldiers. Major Gangl stepped forward and saluted. "We are here to help," he told the stunned Frenchmen. In that moment, the lines between friend and foe dissolved. For one brief, improbable day, soldiers who had been enemies for 6 long years would stand shoulder to shoulder, defending a castle and the ideals of humanity against a common enemy. That night, scouts reported movement in the forest below. The SS was coming. A full battalion of about 150 fanatics, armed and furious, marching toward the castle. Inside, Captain Lee organized the defense. There were barely 40 defenders, a mix of American tankers, German Wehrmacht soldiers, and armed French prisoners who insisted on joining the fight. Even the tennis champion Jean Borotra took up a rifle, his athletic hands trembling with adrenaline. They positioned themselves along the walls, setting up machine guns and rifles. The Sherman tank stood at the main gate, its cannon aimed down the road. At dawn, the SS attacked. The forest erupted with gunfire. Bullets cracked against stone. Grenades exploded against the courtyard walls. The defenders fired back with everything they had. For hours, the castle shook with the roar of battle. Smoke filled the courtyard. The defenders ran low on ammunition but refused to yield. The Americans fought with grim determination. The Germans, once enemies, fought fiercely beside them. Above it all, the French captives shouted encouragement, hurling insults at the SS and laughing through the chaos, the irony of the moment not lost on them. The Battle of Castle Itter had begun, the strangest, most symbolic fight of the Second World War. By midday, the SS pressed harder. They managed to blow a hole in the outer wall, forcing the defenders back toward the inner courtyard. Ammunition was nearly gone. Communication lines were dead. Amid the chaos, Major Joseph Gangl, the German officer who had chosen honor over obedience, spotted one of the French prisoners exposed to sniper fire. Without hesitation, he rushed forward to pull the man to safety. A shot rang out. Gangl fell instantly, struck by a sniper's bullet to the head. Captain Lee and his men dragged him inside, but it was too late. The man who had defied his own army to protect strangers died on the spot. His death electrified the defenders. Rage replaced fear. Every man, American, German, and French, took up arms again, vowing not to let the SS take the castle. Outside, the attackers regrouped for a final assault. Inside, the defenders prepared for the end. Smoke, blood, and exhaustion filled the air, but they held the line, waiting for a miracle. Unbeknownst to them, that miracle was already on its way. A larger American force racing through the mountains to their rescue. The afternoon sun turned the castle walls into glowing embers. Smoke billowed from shattered windows. The defenders were exhausted, faces blackened with soot, hands trembling from fatigue and adrenaline. Captain Jack Lee, pacing the courtyard, could hear the clatter of machine gun fire bouncing off the ramparts. "Hold your fire," he yelled. "Make every shot count." The SS attackers had the high ground now, using trees and rocks as cover. They fired from every direction, trying to overwhelm the defenders. Inside the castle, bullets ricocheted off stone corridors and plaster rained from the ceilings. The French prisoners fought like lions. General Gamelin, who had once commanded armies of hundreds of thousands, now crouched behind a parapet with a rifle in his hands. Borotra, the tennis champion, darted from wall to wall, carrying ammunition. The Sherman tank, Besotten Jenny, roared defiantly, its main gun pounding the enemy line until its ammunition ran dry. The tank's crew kept firing with their sidearms through the open hatches. When a lucky Panzerfaust shell hit the tank's track, immobilizing it, Lee ordered it turned into a steel bunker. The crew stayed inside, firing through the smoke. Then came a lull, brief, eerie silence. The defenders were down to their last magazines. The dead lay scattered near the gates. The SS regrouped in the woods, preparing for a final push. Lee looked to the horizon, praying for the sound of engines. None came. They were alone. For a fleeting moment, time stood still. The Americans, the Germans, and the French prisoners all shared the same grim thought. This might be their last stand. The next assault came with fury. Dozens of SS troops charged up the slope yelling, firing automatic weapons, and throwing grenades over the walls. The air filled with smoke and flying stone. Inside the courtyard, chaos erupted. Defenders scrambled from post to post, returning fire wherever they could. The French generals, who had spent years behind bars, now fought like men reborn. They shouted defiance from the battlements, their voices hoarse but unbroken. Captain Lee moved through the carnage, rallying the men. "We hold this line," he shouted. "Nobody gets through." Beside him, one of the German soldiers, Sergeant Kurt Siegfried Schroeder, fired until his rifle clicked empty, then grabbed a fallen SS weapon and kept shooting. "For Gangel," he cried, and others took up the call. "For Gangel," echoed through the courtyard, a battle cry that blurred all nationalities. The SS kept coming. They were relentless, driven by blind fanaticism. They crawled up through ditches, climbing over their own dead to reach the gates. But every time they broke cover, the defenders cut them down. Even as ammunition dwindled, the men of Castle Itter refused to surrender. The fighting dragged on for hours. Smoke thickened. The air reeked of gunpowder and burning oil. Lee knew they couldn't last much longer, but surrender was unthinkable. And then, just as the defenders braced for one more wave, someone shouted from the tower, "Engines!" "On the road!" The sound grew louder. The low thunder of diesel engines echoed through the valley. Reinforcements were coming. From the northern road, dust clouds appeared, American half-tracks and jeeps racing through the alpine curves. It was a relief column from the 142nd Infantry Regiment, led by Major John Kramers. The rescuers had followed the trail of gunfire and wreckage through the hills, guided by villagers who spoke of a castle under siege by the SS. As they approached, they saw smoke rising from the ridge, Castle Itter under attack. Without hesitation, Kramers ordered his men forward. The first American vehicles burst onto the road below the fortress, machine guns blazing. The SS troops, caught off guard, turned in panic. Their tight encirclement shattered under the sudden assault. From the castle walls, the exhausted defenders cheered. Some laughed, some wept. Captain Lee grabbed a field radio and called down to the convoy, "Castle Itter. Friendly forces inside. Don't shoot the Germans, they're with us." The attackers scattered into the forest. A few tried to hold their ground, firing back, but the overwhelming firepower of the advancing Americans crushed their resistance. Within minutes, it was over. The siege of Castle Itter, one of the strangest battles in history, had ended in victory. When the shooting stopped, the defenders looked at one another, American, German, French, unsure what to say. They had fought together, bled together, and somehow survived together. The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire. It was the silence of disbelief and respect. When the dust settled, the courtyard of Castle Itter looked like a medieval graveyard. Bullet holes riddled the walls. The tank lay silent, and bodies of SS troops littered the hillside below. Captain Lee stood beside the fallen body of Major Joseph Gangel, his ally turned comrade. He ordered the men to carry Gangel's remains to a quiet corner of the courtyard, where they covered him with a German flag. Not the Nazi banner, but the old tricolor of black, red, and gold. "He fought for the right side," Lee said quietly. "Remember that." The French prisoners gathered nearby. For the first time in years, they were free, but the price had been heavy. They thanked the Americans and the German soldiers alike. General Gamelin removed his cap in silent tribute. Borotra, his face streaked with grime, said simply, "He was a true soldier." As the wounded were tended to and weapons collected, the Americans prepared to evacuate the VIPs. The sound of distant artillery reminded them that the war was not yet fully done, though its end was hours away. By nightfall, Castle Itter was secure. The defenders, now brothers in arms, sat together for a brief meal, a strange, peaceful silence filling the ancient halls. In that moment, they weren't divided by flags or languages. They were simply men who had done the right thing when it mattered most. The next morning, May 6th, dawn broke over the Tyrolean mountains. The sky was clear, the air still. For the first time in years, no gunfire echoed through the valleys. American troops escorted the French prisoners down from the castle to awaiting jeeps. Cameras captured their faces, weary but smiling, disbelief still lingering in their eyes. Captain Lee, his uniform blackened with smoke, oversaw the evacuation. Before leaving, he paused one last time at the courtyard where Major Gangle had fallen. "You made the right choice," he murmured. In the following days, the story spread across Allied lines. Americans and Germans had fought together against the SS. Many thought it was a rumor, a myth too unbelievable to be true. But it wasn't a myth. It had happened, high in the Austrian Alps in the final hours of the war. Major Gangle was posthumously declared a hero of Austria. Streets and memorials now bear his name. Captain Jack Lee received the Distinguished Service Cross, and Castle Itter itself still stands, a silent witness to the day enemies became brothers, and the last battle of Europe became its most human one. In the weeks after Germany's surrender, reports of the Castle Itter battle began to surface in Allied newspapers, though many dismissed them as exaggerated tales from the WWII front. American and German soldiers fight, side by side against SS troops, one headline read. Editors hesitated, unsure whether to print it. How could former enemies, locked in 6 years of brutal conflict, suddenly unite in the same fight? But the facts held true. Soldiers' testimonies, photographs, and captured documents confirmed every detail. The U.S. Army's 23rd Tank Battalion had fought alongside Wehrmacht troops under Major Joseph Gangle, all to defend a handful of French prisoners against the SS. For the French survivors, the memory of Itter was unforgettable. Paul Reynaud called it a moment of humanity amid insanity. Jean Borotra, the tennis champion, told interviewers, "It was as if the world paused, just long enough for men to remember what it means to be decent." For the Americans who had fought there, it became one of those strange, haunting stories they'd tell only years later, about the day they realized not every German soldier had fought for evil. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The final European battle of World War II wasn't a clash between nations, but between decency and fanaticism, between those who still believed in power and those who believed in doing what was right. Castle Itter had become a symbol, not of war's madness, but of the fragile spark of humanity that can survive even in its darkest hour. After the battle, the defenders of Castle Itter went their separate ways, but none ever forgot what happened on that mountain. Captain Jack Lee returned to America a quiet man. Decorated with the Distinguished Service Cross, he lived a modest life, rarely speaking of the war. When he did, he spoke of Major Gangle, the bravest man I ever knew. Major Joseph Gangle was buried with full honors in Austria. His grave became a local shrine, visited by those who had once lived under Nazi terror. In 1970, the town of Würgl named a street after him, Josef Gangelstrasse. For Austrians, he symbolized the conscience of a nation that had been lost to madness. Sergeant Schrader, one of Gangle's men who survived, testified decades later that fighting beside the Americans was like stepping out of a nightmare. He said, "For the first time, I fought not because I was ordered to, but because I wanted to." The French prisoners returned to a liberated France. Some resumed politics, others retired quietly. They had seen the very worst of war, and one of its rarest moments of redemption. In every survivor's memory, the castle stood not as a prison, but as a place where enemies found their humanity again. After the war, Castle Itter stood abandoned for years. The wall still bore the scars of gunfire. The courtyard still whispered of that furious day in May 1945. Local villagers avoided it. They called it the Haunted Castle. But time, as it always does, began to heal the wounds. Grass grew over bullet holes. The stones weathered. Eventually, the castle was restored by private owners. Tourists who visit today see a quiet fortress nestled among the pines, unaware that its stones once echoed with shouts in 3 languages, German, English, and French, all joined in a single desperate fight. Inside the old courtyard, a small plaque tells the story. Here on May 5, 1945, soldiers of opposing armies fought side by side for freedom against tyranny. No grand monuments, no military parades, just quiet words on stone, surrounded by the silence of the mountains. It is perhaps the most fitting memorial of all. For the story of Castle Itter was never about victory or glory. It was about conscience and the courage to defy hatred when it mattered most. For decades, the Battle of Castle Itter remained a footnote in history, overshadowed by the grand narratives of D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, and Berlin's fall. It was barely mentioned in textbooks, but among historians, whispers persisted. The day Americans and Germans fought together. It sounded like fiction, but it was fact. Only in later years did documentaries, books, and researchers bring the story back to light. In the 21st century, as old records were declassified and survivors' letters were found, the full truth of that extraordinary alliance emerged. It was not just a curious tale, it was a revelation about human nature. That even at the edge of annihilation, there were men willing to cross impossible lines to do what was right. Today, military academies study Castle Itter not as a great tactical feat, but as a moral one. It proved that bravery has no uniform and decency no border. And as new generations learn the story, they see it not as the last battle of World War II, but the first act of reconciliation that followed it. Every spring, as the snow melts in Tyrol, the old castle seems to awaken again. Birds nest in the battlements, the pine forests hum with life. Yet for those who know its story, the air still feels sacred. Some say on quiet evenings, when the wind rolls through the valley, you can almost hear the echo of that battle, the shouts, the gunfire, the tank's final roar fading into silence. Locals still tell the story of the French captives who found freedom, the Americans who refused to abandon them, and the German officer who gave his life for honor. It is a story of war's contradictions, of men trained to hate, choosing instead to protect, of courage born not from command but from conscience, and perhaps that is what makes Castle Itter so hauntingly beautiful. It was not the place where war ended. It was where humanity for a fleeting moment returned. Today, Castle Itter stands as a quiet monument to one of history's most unlikely moments of unity. In a world still divided by flags and ideologies, its story reminds us that the line between good and evil does not run between nations. It runs through every human heart. On May 5, 1945, in a forgotten Austrian valley, men who had once faced each other through gun sights stood together for something greater than victory. They stood for humanity, and though decades have passed, their story endures. Every soldier who hears it, every historian who retells it finds the same truth. In war's darkest hour, the light of decency can still shine. The Battle of Castle Itter was not just a military footnote. It was a moral triumph, a whisper from the past reminding us that even when the world burns, there is still room for courage, compassion, and honor. The guns have long fallen silent. The castle sleeps under the alpine sun, but the spirit of those who fought there, American, German, and French, still walks its halls, enemies once, brothers forever.